Okay, hello, good manners. Today we are going to discuss what is attribute. So defined for a particular object, properties, or elements. So in SQL, we can say that the object, the table objects is uh, has the characteristic of its own, a unique characteristic of its own, and it contains a property that has also uh, uh, characteristics or attributes each. Okay, so let's uh, move into sequels to see uh, the the example of that attributes. Okay, okay, for this example, let's say that we have a table name employees. Okay, so the employees is a table. Okay, a table or a SQL database objects. Okay, so we know this is a table. Okay, and what was the table of that particular, what was the characteristic or the function will be for this particular table. Okay, by the name itself we can clearly or defines uh, each characteristic already or functions that this particular table will store the informations of employees. Okay, specifically for the employees. Okay, so that is the characteristic of the objects is to employee. That is the characteristic of the object employee is to store the employees data. Okay, and and nothing else. Okay, so it is defined to store employee employees data. Okay, informations. So and this also contains the property name and sorry employee ID. Okay, and the the property uh, name. Okay, so what was it again? Okay, the object or property, it defines the function or characteristic of, I mean, uh, the the attribute is defining the characteristic or function of particular object, which is the employee, and also the characteristic of each properties. And here we have two properties for the employee. So what was the uh, characteristic of these properties? We have the employee ID and the names. So by the name itself, we can already define that these particular properties will be storing data for employee specific for employee. Okay, each employee and specific the property names will be storing uh, the, the names of the employees. And so that is the characteristic of these properties. Together we can also define its data type. As a whole, we can say that the employee properties is the characteristic or attribute of employees properties is to store an employee ID as integer. Okay, so for the property name is okay are going to is going to store a characters that is with the length of 50. Okay, so together the property with the the property name and data type can be defined. We can define its characteristic together. Okay, so it means to say the property employee ID is storing the employee ID as integer. Okay, and the name also will be stored as string or character with a length of 50 for the employee name. Okay, so meaning to say that the data type ink for the property and barcars is only part of the whole characteristic of the employee. Okay, employee ID. Okay, and the name with its data type is uh, the whole definition of each characteristic or attribute. Okay, so so here we can already identify the difference between the data type and the attributes. Okay, so the property has an attribute of storing uh, information that is defined, uh, the type of its information to be stored with the data type varchar or integers. Okay, and also with it with the name itself. Okay, so you cannot say that here. You can say name uh, let's say last name. Okay, then you will say that this last name property will be storing employee ID. Okay, by the name itself, we can we cannot see or identify its characteristic, what's data to be stored in this. Okay, uh, on the naming of the properties, just because it is really important to make it readable, and also define the name should be defined its characteristic. Okay, what is the characteristic? The characteristic of this property name should be defined, the name of the property should be defined to each characteristic. Okay, so we cannot say that the last name will be storing uh, employee ID, and that is the 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 part that we cannot do, just because it is misleading. Okay, so however, in order for us to define that whole characteristic of the property, we have to make sure that the the name of the property should be defined, should be named after its characteristic. Okay, so together with its data type, okay, we can fully understand that this particular property functions is for the following, uh, that is on the name itself. Okay, so the naming of the property should be follow after the characteristic. Okay, the attribute that is uh, for the useful implementation of the naming naming attribute. Okay, naming attribute is to make it more readable in human. It should not be given a name that is not with its characteristic. Okay, or attribute. Okay, let's come back into the HTML elements. Okay, so here we can make an example of what is the attribute in terms of HTML markup. Okay, here we can say that we have the elements input. Okay, the input elements has an attribute ID. Okay, so the ID in HTML markup should not be similar to others. Okay, it should be unique. Okay, together with the attribute ID, together with its value, we can define its characteristic. So we already know that the ID, it's defining that element ID. Okay, ID or identification. When we say identification, this should be unique to all of the elements. Okay, that you are using. Okay, so together with this uh, attribute value, we can clearly see what is the elements usage in particular. Let's say, for example, in this one, we can say this should be a employee. Okay, name. Okay, and that means this input elements is reserved for the inputting of inputting or displaying employee name. Okay, so the attribute ID together with its value is defining the whole characteristic of its elements. Okay, input elements. Okay, so the ID is defining the ID attribute is defining that the particular elements uh, has a unique uh, attribute ID with the value of employee name. So we cannot make it like this. So how can you define that which one is for the employee name? Okay, so ID attribute ID should be given only with a unique value. Okay, so maybe in this first one we can say employee ID. Okay, okay, so that's it. The again what we learned about is we know what is the attribute uh, on HTML markup, and we also know what is the attribute on HTML uh, SQL server or SQL database. And also I will also discuss, additionally we can discuss that in uh, XML also similar to this. XML it has also the attribute of like name. Okay, so XML has similar uh, uh, attribute it is similar on HTML markup when it comes to defining attributes. Okay, so the attributes names with each value uh, together can define the characteristic, the whole characteristic of the elements or functions. So meaning to say that in the particular input ID with the value of employee ID is we can definitely say that this input elements is to store or to display the employee ID, and this particular input elements with the ID equals employee name is to display or import employee name. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you, and you may subscribe to my channel in order for you to be updated on my next video about web development.